Hey everyone, how's it going? Hey, this is Brian again with Standing Strong for Marriages. What I'm going to try to do today is do a book review on a book called Divorce, Remarriage in the Bible. The author's name is David Instone-Brewer. It's on Amazon. You can get it on Audible, other places. Okay, let's get to it. All right, my friends. So this is the book, Divorce, Remarriage in the Bible, social literary context. And, it was really good. I was a little thrown by the cover. So for you that don't know The Lovers, I didn't know who this was. 1929, Rene Magritte. I don't know if that's how his name is pronounced, or maybe a woman. But The Lovers too. Anyway, so there it is. No charge for the art tour. Okay, anyway, so let's get into this. So, okay, scrolling down. So, like I said, I love the table of contents, so let's look at what we have here. So basically he goes over, he looks at marriage as a contract in the culture of the Jewish people and then of Jesus, and looked at a lot of how people did marriage contracts, the way that divorces were done, the rights to people post-divorce, as far as dowries or money that people were able to take with them, how it worked. The Pentateuch, divorce certificates. A lot of people know about the famous passage where Moses was, gave people the ability to, give one another divorce certificates. He gets into that. It's something that Jesus refers to a lot, and questions that people brought to Jesus. The latter prophets, which is really interesting. Breaking marriage vows is condemned, is the subtitle for that. The intertestamental period between the end of the New Testament, the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament, about 400-year period. The rabbis, this is really interesting to me. Jesus' teachings, Paul's teachings, marriage vows, the history of divorce, modern reinterpretations, and pastoral conclusions. So it is, 300 pages, not something you can just, for most people, do in one sitting. So it's pretty interesting. So that's essentially the book. Let me just pause this and we'll come back and I'll get to some of my notes. Okay, so as an overview, I'm going to try to hit these 5 points just for you guys to know kind of where we're going with this and if these are points of interest to you. So number one, that God went through his own divorce, something that I don't think a lot of people maybe even realize. Two, that divorces were very common in Jesus' time. Again, something that may strike us as surprising. Three, that having children or having a family is not required, and it's also not grounds for divorce. Four, he helps us define and look at what an adulterous marriage is, an adulterous second marriage. And number five, he looks at how a person can know if they are free to remarry. So that's kind of some of the bigger points, I think. So to get started, he notes out that adultery, because some of the New Testament verses talk about adultery, he goes back and references that actually if you look at the Old Testament law, the way that the Jewish people governed themselves, adultery was a capital crime. So it wasn't like small peas. It was a huge deal that could cost you, a person their life. So it definitely wasn't taken lightly. And he notices that, adultery was one of the reasons that the land actually vomited the people out. So there was the promised land. They had, taken possession of that. If you know what I mean. And then, the Jewish nation, they lost the place that God promised them to be their home for things like adultery. Okay, so the next big point, Deuteronomy 24, 1 and 2. This is the text, the famous text that many people would come to Jesus and ask him about. Moses said it was okay for us to, give our wives a divorce certificate. What do you say? Essentially was the question he got. And so it does speak of that. I'll read it really quickly if I can. Sorry, I should have had it ready to go. I did, I thought. Yeah, so it says when a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and uh, puts it in her hands and sends her out from the house. And she leaves the house and goes and becomes another man's wife, and then it goes on. But so essentially, that's the verse. Why people were talking about and why there was this idea that writing a divorce certificate was acceptable in God's eyes. Um, and Jesus had some things to say about that. We'll get to that later. But one thing to really notice that is from Deuteronomy 24, 1 and 2, first two verses, I'm sorry, was that there has always been a bit of controversy about that term, some indecency. And I'll try to get to that in a second. But it was always a contested term. People didn't know, it's not defined. So at least here. And so there was and continues to be some debate about what that means. It does say that it frequently connotates sexual sin and that it's not only restricted to adultery. And I think that's right because there's a special word, especially in the Greek, for adultery that's different from the word for a more general sexual sin. So it does seem that it's not exclusive to just adultery. Anyway, the traditional rabbinic view was that the covenant could be broken if either side did not live up to their part of the agreement, which I think is interesting. So I'm just going to give this to you guys as it is, and then you'll notice that there's going to be some things that don't exactly always agree. For example, it says in Ezekiel 36 and 37 that a covenant was seen as an agreement that a faithful person would not break even if the other party broke their end of it. So this would be like a theological covenant, a New Testament covenant, and so we have some thinking to do about where we believe that marriage best falls. Does it fall into a covenantal agreement where you're going to keep your end of the bargain even if the other person doesn't live up to it, as I just said, or if it's more like a business contract where if both parties don't live up to their agreement, then it's if anyone defaults on their end, then it's over. So what he says, which is really interesting, is that the Sinai covenant, what he means is the teachings of Moses in the Old Testament and the first 5 books of the Bible were given to the Jewish people at Sinai. And so Sinai had like a certain way that it worked. It was like it was more of a business contract based on performance, that if you did the right things, then you could expect rewards. If you did the wrong things, then you could expect punishments and problems. And so in light, oppositely, the new covenant, the New Testament covenant that God makes with Christians is, he says that he's going to stick with us even when we screw up. And so so that's something to really consider, something to think about. It said in the larger culture, the Old Testament, the Near Eastern cultures, treated it much more like a business agreement, more than, I'm going to stand by you for forever no matter what happens. It was much more like if they don't live up to their side, then, it's over kind of thing. So he says that he thinks that the marriage covenant idea is actually a misleading term in modern times. So that's something that I use. I use the idea of the marriage covenant, the covenantal relationship, the marriage bond. He would disagree me on that point. He thinks that it's misleading and that people should instead use the term marriage contract, meaning that he thinks it's at least by this point, better if people say, if he doesn't do everything he's supposed to do, if she doesn't do everything she's supposed to do, if anybody messes it up, then it's a broken deal, and people can dissolve that and move on. Anyway, chapter 2, the Pentateuch. So this is the first 5 books of the Old Testament. It said that the law of Moses gave more rights and more opportunities for remarriage compared to the larger culture. Again, he talks again about whatever that indecency term meant. There were some other points that I'm not going to touch on. I'm not going to touch on this. There was more rights to widows. There was more rights given to people who were victims of rape. There was some problem in acquiring a divorce certificate, but essentially the purpose of that document was to be able to have proof and go to the community that there was no disagreement about was a person married or not. This document kind of spoke to that. And so if a person had a divorce certificate and they were looking to remarry, then that would be very helpful in being able to do that. Yes. It kind of protected people from their ex coming around and saying, no, we're still married. I mean, that's kind of what he says. It helped people move on in that sense, I suppose. So chapter 3, the latter prophets. He spends a lot of time talking about the breaking of the marriage vows condemned, and he looks at these different books, Hosea, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. It says that they all show a picture of a God who divorces his bride reluctantly because his wife consistently breaks her marriage vows, and the no shame was attached to him because it wasn't his fault. It was the acts of Judah and Israel. Goes on to say that there's a real famous verse that you'll hear from Malachi where it basically says that God hates divorce. You'll hear that all the time at church and stuff that people talk about this topic, that God hates divorce, that the person who divorces their spouse whom they should protect clothes themselves, puts on shame and violence. And so a lot of people say, yes, that makes sense, that divorce is shameful in that sense, and it does great violence to people on mental, emotional levels. And so that's often quoted a lot. Anyway, in the story of Hosea, this is an interesting story. If you don't know it, it's basically it's kind of a longer story. It's, I guess, if I'm going to describe it, I would say that it's like an allegorical story of a man who was who was asked to marry a prostitute, and she was unfaithful to him, and in the end he took her back despite her unfaithfulness. And this was like a picture of God's marriage, his willingness to take back his wife being the people that he had chosen, Judah and Israel. So that's one thing they talk about, but they say that Hosea is very difficult to translate, and so again, that's you get some confusion there about what it all means and kind of what to say at the end of the day. And I just bring that up because, like I said, there is a lot of confusion and a lot of different opinions out there among Christians, and so this is part of the reason why I'm just trying to unpack it to help kind of bring light of where people are coming from, maybe where they get some of their ideas on the issue. Hosea 9:15, it says, God says, I began to hate, i.e. Divorce them, because of their wickedness and of their deeds. And he said that I will drive them out of my house, and I will love them no more. So drive them out of my house. There was many people ended up being taken captive to either Babylon or there was an Assyrian occupation at one point, and so many people were forced either to leave their homelands against their will. And it says because of some of these things, which I'll get to in a second about the details. It says that God was forced into the divorce and he suffered it. But there's also this hope of a remarriage to a united nation of Israel and Judah together. And you can see that in Romans 11 if you've read that chapter. It talks about kind of the restoration. And he says that he pictures it would be like a relationship with a completely new wife. And it's a vision of a remarriage to a virgin and not an adulterous divorcee. So that's interesting, you know. I think for me that gives a lot of hope as far as the work that God can do in people's lives. That seems like you know, not possible. How can an adulterous divorcee become a virgin? You know, but that's what it talks about. The story continues in Jeremiah. Jeremiah speaks of Judah is following the same path of idolatry that Israel followed, and that Israel had already been exiled at that point, that Judah lusted after other gods and made alliances with other nations, and that she was shamed, and that, you know, she ended up being threatened with divorce. But yet in Jeremiah 31, it says Israel will be restored as a virgin, and Judah will be restored as her with one, as one nation. So maybe I don't know. That's okay. Let's just keep going. Ezekiel 23 pictures God as married as well to well, yes. This is good. Okay. Yeah, so Israel was given over to the Assyrians. Judah was taken into captivity in Babylon. So it says some of the reasons for God's divorce to his people can be found in Ezekiel 16. There was adultery talked about in Ezekiel 23, and that the people had adopted these practices of sacrificing their children to idols, also in Ezekiel 23, which was... it, I guess, need not be said that God said, "Be fruitful and multiply." So sacrificing children to idols was kind of the opposite of that. Okay. Isaiah talks about Israel, and he says, he sees them as a faithful city like Jerusalem, who became a harlot, but was not divorced, though has been forsaken. That's in has not been divorced is chapter 50, verse 1. Though has not been forsaken, chapter 54, verses 4 through 7. And to be married again, chapter 62, 4 and 5. So this is kind of what it says, just as the recap. Some of those books are quite long and they take a lot of work to work through, so I think this is much easier. Isaiah claims that God still loves them, even though they are in exile, and that was a really hard time for them. So, you know, I think it's good to know that God still loves us, whether we're, you know, the ones that are waiting or the ones that, you know, are kind of away from home. You could say that no matter what our situation is, that God loves us. Okay. Moving on, Malachi. It says Malachi that God loves his bride in chapter 1, verses 2 through 5. That he did receive a lot of disrespect. Chapter 1, verse 6 through 14. Which my notes say which was a breaking of the covenant. Some of the other things that were described in chapters 2 and 3 were the breaking of the vows, the non-payment of tithes, the use of magic, adultery, perjury, oppression of employees, widows, orphans, and foreigners. So, you know, I think I'll just add one of my own comments here, is that, you know, we often think that these larger issues, societal issues, don't really affect people or affect the God's not I don't know. I don't hear a lot of people. I mean, they're definitely out there, but I just think it's a good wake up call, a good thing to keep in mind. What else? Moving on, chapter 4, it says the Intertestamental Period. This was the 400-year period between the end of the Old Testament writings and the beginning of basically the New Testament writings with Jesus, John the Baptist showing up on the scene. So basically he says that this period didn't provide any writings or teachings on marriage, divorce, or remarriage that were new. There was just, but that the intertestamental period saw more rights to women and a greater instability in marriage. That divorce, including no-fault divorce, became more common. Financial help to divorced women made divorce appear to be less cruel. So moving on to chapter 5, the rabbinic teachings, and this was really interesting. If it's been a little dry, I apologize, but I think this is really interesting. I didn't know this. So as you know, Jesus was a rabbi, if you didn't know he was. So he would have, in my understanding, by the time he was 12 years old, he would have memorized the first 5 books of the Old Testament law. He would have been very, very familiar with all those verses in order to make the sacrifice for his family in the temple when he was 12. So from my understanding, that's why that's an important passage put in the New Testament in the Gospels, because it's a signaler to us that he had moved through all the steps, that he had kind of passed that rite of passage. Anyway, as a rabbi, he would have been very, very familiar with the teachings, the legal teachings on the matters, as well as what was going on in the rabbinic circles among the rabbis, among the teachers of the law at the time. So the thing is really interesting. You kind of had 2 groups, and I didn't know this, but one was the Hillelite group. And if you remember, we were talking about that verse from Deuteronomy 24, 1 and 2, that verse that said that a person could divorce his wife for a matter of indecency, right? That was the word, indecency. And there was some disagreement about what did that mean? Well, one group, the Hillelites, they basically took that to mean almost anything. They really came down with this view that divorce for any reason, that divorce could just mean whatever a person wanted, and if they were not happy, you didn't have to go look any further. It was just open and closed case. That was it. So the other group was the Shamites, and that group was more restrictive. They were more conserved. They were more, they didn't want just divorce for any reason. And so you had these competing views, and you had individuals that subscribed to one view or the other. And I think that was really interesting to me. That's something I didn't know. And that what had happened was really when Jesus walked the earth, that the Hillelites were more popular, and after his death and the next generation to follow, the Hillelite group really won the day. It really became quite common for divorces, which may be surprising. If you're like me, I thought traditional times, traditional families, traditional values, agrarian systems, people that kind of stayed in one place and focused around the family. Apparently that just wasn't the case. That wasn't the actual view of what was going on according to this author's research. So one thing that was really interesting, since we're talking about the Pentateuch and the rabbinic teachings, was grounds for divorce in Exodus. Now, I've been in church for a long time, most of my life. I have seminary training. I feel like I've been a pretty serious student of the Bible for many, many years. And, I never came across this one. I never think I've heard any pastor bring this up. I've never heard it on any radio station. I've never heard it referenced in any book. And so this might be really interesting to you. So this is from Exodus, chapter 21, 10 and 11. It's talking about essentially some laws and some rights for a slave woman who was married. And it basically says that she has the rights to food, to clothing, and to sex. Conjugal rights is what it says. And that neglecting these things gave her the ability to walk out of the marriage. Now, I had never ever heard until I read this book that the withholding of sex was biblical grounds for marriage, and so this was for me one of the big things that I never knew. So you can check that out, Exodus 21:10 and 11. Um, it's interesting. Here's some other things that are interesting to note. First century rabbinic world allowed divorce for things like infertility, sexual unfaithfulness, um, or material or emotional neglect. Infertility, one thing that was really interesting too, that we'll get to, is that um, the Jewish people felt like there was something like 600, I want to say 618, 607 commands in the Old Testament given to God's people that they should follow. And one of the first ones was from Genesis, the early chapters after God makes the world and makes man and brings woman into the picture, is he says to them, go and multiply, be fruitful. And so many Jewish people, they thought that this is something that God wants us to do, that this author, according to his research, said that the average Jewish person at that time would have thought that it was just like obvious, like everyone should get married and have children, like that was required and that's what they should do. And well, we come to find out that Jesus really turns the tide on that one when we see later that he says that it's okay that some people will choose not to go that route, and that he gives a stamp of approval on that. So I'll try to get that verse here as we move forward. But I thought that was an interesting thing, that cultural insight. So chapter 6, Jesus' teachings. It says that the point that divorce was not commanded, but it was allowed by Moses because of the hardness of heart. And he does an interesting thing, because this is Jesus' answer. People come to him, they say, Moses said that we could divorce our wives, that we could write them a certificate of divorce and send them away for any reason. What do you say? And what he said is that God brings a man and a woman together, and he says, what God has brought together, let no one separate. But he said that Moses allowed for them to give this certificate of divorce because of the hardness of their hearts. And David Instone-Brewer, this author, he says that there's perhaps 4 possible meanings for what that could mean. Number 1, does hardness of heart mean that there was a person in the marriage who just persisted in stubborn sinfulness, like Jeremiah 4:4 or Jeremiah 31, some of the stuff that we talked about, where people just refuse to repent or even admit that they're doing something wrong. So 1, stubborn sinfulness. Or it could be number 2, that it's the people who are handing out the divorce certificates that are being unreasonable and being stubborn and being hard of heart, that they're not being forgiving or merciful or understanding or empathetic or humble, realizing that they have sins of their own. This is maybe number 2. Third possible one would be that it was the Jewish people as a whole who were stubbornly demanding for rights to divorce, so that they wanted divorce to be an option on the table, and they just bugged Moses and they bugged him and they asked for it and they demanded it and they made all these complaints, and they just instead of listening to some of these other teachings, he finally said, you know what, fine, we can make some provision for that if that's how it is. Or number 4, stubbornly refusing to give divorce certificates. What did I mean when I read that? Oh, it would mean that, like, if a person was wanted out of a marriage, and the people would use these legal means basically to keep them locked into a marriage that they didn't want to be in. Maybe even if they had the rights to leave, if they didn't have the paperwork to leave, it would cause them a lot of problems as far as trying to get remarried without the divorce certificate. So I think he meant for women who, were asking for a divorce certificate from their husbands, and the husbands just wouldn't grant it. So he goes on to talk about a lot of the big verses. So Mark 10 through 12, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her, and if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. Matthew 19:9, whoever divorces his wife unless for indecency, that was again from Deuteronomy 24, 1 and 2, except unless for indecency and marries another commits adultery. Okay. Matthew 5:31 through 32, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you, anyone who divorces his wife except for a matter of indecency makes her an adulteress, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. And so, like I mentioned in the beginning, adultery was a huge deal. I mean, it was a capital crime. People could lose their life for it. So, also, we see that God, all that happens with the adultery in his situation, and what happened with people being held in captivity, taken as slaves to foreign lands, it was a huge deal. So something to definitely just be aware of, which I think you are if you're watching this channel. So then he goes into, so what about an invalid divorce and an adulterous second marriage? And he points out three things, three possibilities, and then he explains those. So situation number one, someone marries an invalidly divorced individual. Someone marries an invalidly divorced individual. He says that that's the Luke 16:18 verse. That's the Matthew 5:23 verse. And here's what he says about it. He says, in that situation, the people of that time, it was a well-accepted scenario that was clearly understood to be adulterous. So if, person A is considering marrying someone else, and they are aware that this someone else is invalidly divorced, that they should not proceed with marrying them. That if they did so, that would be adultery for them and for the other person. The logic being that an invalidly divorced person is still in a marriage contract and a marriage covenant that's still binding. So, all right, number two. It says a person is given an invalid divorce and is caused to commit adultery. So again, Matthew 5:23, Matthew 19:9, and here's his comment on that. He says in situation number two, where a person is divorced against their will and it was invalid, he says that perhaps a person wants to remarry, and so if they do, we'll call him the victim in this person, the person who was divorced against their will for not good reasons. It says if they decide to remarry, then they would commit adultery, but that it could be seen that the adultery isn't their fault. It's not their responsibility, and it doesn't fall on their shoulders. Or it could be partially their fault and partially their first spouse's fault, and so then it's kind of split, I guess, amongst the two individuals from the first marriage. Situation number three. It says a person invalidly divorces their spouse, leaves, and then marries someone else while not being free to do so. So this is Mark 10, verse 11, Matthew 19:19, Luke 16:18. And this is his comments on this. It says, since Jesus was clearly against divorce in general, and he was in favor of monogamy, it says that this would mean that a second adulterous marriage, like marriage on paper, was in fact invalid, and that cohabitating with another married person, was considered adultery. See Mark. Yes. Again, the exception clause, broader than just adultery. Divorce could be there could be grounds for divorce for reasons other than just than adultery, but it could include other sexual sins like incest, like all kinds of things. Now, this was really interesting. other grounds for divorce. It says that when Jesus only mentioned certain things, uh, this author says that he thinks that Jesus' silence suggests that he agreed with the rabbinic traditions on the other areas of valid divorce. So one, the silent Old Testament reasons were not being debated in the sense that, and he uses some great examples, but it's like if there's a big debate basically, and people are talking about just this one aspect of it, where there's all the heat and all the conflict and all the conversation and is about this one thing. Say maybe if it was like, I don't know, this is a bad example, but say like a sports match, right? Like, one team just won the whole time, and then there was this one play that changed the course of everything. And so there's all this talk and debate about this one area, right? Basically, what the author is trying to point out here is that if everybody's on the same page about all of this stuff, and no one brings it up, there's no questions about it, there's no like re-clarification, it's not restated, or if it's not restated because it doesn't need to be. There's no controversy on those issues. And so, no one's up in arms about it. It's like in America, the voting age is 18. People aren't talking about that because it's not up for debate. Everybody gets it. There's, generally like a consensus that that's what we all agree upon, and that's fine. And so people aren't out there arguing about it because there's nothing to argue about. And that's what he said. Jesus said as far as, when people came and asked him on very specific issues, he spoke to those issues. And if he didn't speak or clarify or give any teaching on those things, Mr. Brewer says that he thinks that silence should communicate to us, as well as to his audience at the time, that he is in agreement with everything else that's being said, with the general consensus view on things. That if he didn't need to correct or clarify anything, then he didn't need to. He was in agreement with it, and he just spoke to the things that he thought needed correction or clarification. And so when people ask him about these issues, he just gave that clarification. What that means for us is that if we don't find that Jesus is disagreeing with something, or restating it, or changing it, or disagreeing with it, then we can go with the other things that we find in scriptures as valid and helpful and applicable to our situation. Chapter 7 talks about Paul's teachings, basically that Paul was trying to address problems that Jesus did not address, i.e. what happens when one spouse is a Christian and the other isn't. That's 1 Corinthians 7. Just 2 points that Paul definitely sees and talks about: the benefits of getting married in order to avoid sexual temptation, but that he's also aware that there was a famine at the time, there was a difficult situation, just in general, and that it is difficult to, as we know, like serve God and keep Him happy and do all that He wants, as well as do everything that our spouse wants and requires and looks for and wants to keep them happy. That it's more to juggle and it is a more difficult thing. What he does touch on, just to kind of end here, is so what is the meaning of not bound? So this is important because many people are trying to figure out, do I have the green light to remarry, to date? Does God expect me to wait for Him, to seek restoration and reconciliation with my previous spouse? What should I do? How should I handle that? I don't want to, get into adultery. I do have the fear of God. I'm not sure what that means, and I applaud you for that, trying to figure it out. Well, here's what David says based on 1 Corinthians 7. He talks about this phrase, not bound, and he says there's 4 possible things that might mean, and he basically throws out the first 3 and he goes with number 4. But he covers them all, and I like that. He says number 1, not bound, i.e. free to separate. And he says, well, that doesn't make any sense. The person is already separated against their will, so no, that doesn't seem to be a good reason of what not bound would mean. Not bound by a covenant or vows, marriage vows. All right, number 2, he says, well, maybe it could mean free to remain separated. Yeah, but I mean, that's, he says, the same as the first one, that they're separated against their will, and so it doesn't really seem to make much sense. Number 3, it says free to divorce. Well, that's the same as above. Again, he says that free to divorce would mean, how can you divorce somebody that's already divorced you? I mean, it's, a little ridiculous, right? They're already kind of checked out of the relationship. They've already maybe filed the paperwork, and so what's the point in refiling the same paperwork? I think in some states you can counter sue your spouse for divorce. So I don't know. Maybe that has some legal benefit, but I don't know. I don't see what good it does. Anyway, so David says he goes with number 4, which not bound in his mind is the only logical conclusion would be free to remarry. So this just kind of falls in the light of a lot of people say, yeah, okay, you're not bound to the first person, but you're also not free to remarry. And, this, I'm not going to unpack it all. I think if you want to pick up the book, you can check it out and see what he says. But in the end, what he kind of lands on was that God has called us to live at peace, and those who are divorced against their will should be regarded as validly and legally divorced. They're no longer bound by their marriage contract, and they're free to remarry. So, like I said, I think that that's the end of my notes. I hope it's a helpful book. Maybe before you go and spend a bunch more time reading it and going through all of it. It is a bit technical. I hope maybe this could save you some time. If you want to go pick it up, then that you know a bit more what to look for and to get into. One of the things I didn't mention was that he does this really, really interesting piece on some of the early church fathers. So people maybe the first 10 centuries AD or BCE, I guess it is. And how they had very different views. Some of the people that we think of as the great theologians, Augustus and who were some of the other ones? Origen, Thomas Aquinas, Luther, Calvin. Many, and then a lot of people from the very early days that are not so familiar to me, but essentially that they were important people, and they saw this issue very differently, that they were pastoring people, and some of them, David does a good job, he researches it as a good scholar should, and he points out where some of their views were contradictory. He even goes back and finds when people changed their views on this issue, or admitted that that's what they thought, but they didn't really have very much backing scripturally for holding that view. So, it's interesting in light of not just our time, but that many people have had a difficulty trying to figure out the best way to handle this situation. Anyway, I can understand if you're in a situation where you really want to do the right thing, and you may be kind of stuck between love and forgiveness and believing in God and believing in your spouse, while at the same time realizing that there was difficulties in the relationship, and perhaps having some fear, having some real concerns, some damaged trust, realizing that it would take a lot of work to maybe overcome some of those things. Part of you may want to do that, and I think if you're honest, there's probably part of you that really maybe doesn't want to, or is a bit nervous or concerned about getting back into the relationship with your former spouse. All that is understandable, I would say, and I think that some of these things will help you sort through some of the scriptures as far as what God has to tell you and guide you and give you insights on and wisdom on as far as the things that apply to your situation. God help you either way. If you're going to lock down and pray and wait, maybe you're just going to lock down and pray and wait until you figure out exactly what you want to do. Maybe you feel that sense of confusion. Or maybe, you are just scared to get back out there, scared of being hurt again. Maybe know that you have the green light, but you always, maybe you wonder, what if? Is God, what is God able to do? And maybe you're contemplating, you're waiting around for that, but maybe you're considering more and more moving on. Wherever you are in that situation, I just pray God would help you, and I hope this has been helpful. I guess in general, when it comes to YouTube, a lot of this content is, supported, or you can get, you can help me out by liking or subscribing these things, sharing it with other people. I'm going to try to keep doing these, I think, for a while, but we'll just see how it goes. I'm not sure. We'll see how well it's received, I suppose. Anyway, until next time, this is Brian with Standing Strong for Marriages. Okay, bye.